In Palo Alto, schools have always been a major source of interest among residents. We're here at Channing House, and Steve Steiger from the History Corner is going to tell us something about how all these schools got started here in Palo Alto. Steve, let's start with why did Palo Alto have to start its own school system?
Well, in the beginning, when the town was newly created, the kids of school age had to travel to the town of Mayfield, which is centered around California Avenue, to do their schooling. And the early residents thought that that 2-mile trip was too long. So they wanted to create a school in their own town.
But now really 2 miles, but that would have been in a dusty wagon, don't you remember?
I don't. I traveled in the Model Ts. But 2 miles in a wagon was a long time. In winter times, the roads weren't dusty, they were extremely muddy, and they weren't paved as they were today. So it was a big journey for the kids just to get to school.
All right, now the elementary schools, it started one place, it moved to another place. Can you explain how the elementary schools came about?
Well, the first school was built, I was on Bryant Street between University and Hamilton, and it was a temporary building. It was built in 4 days, and it really only lasted 2 years. And it was built just to house the immediate school need until a proper school building could be built. And that building was built across the street from Channing House here on Channing.
So that's the elementary school, but then at some point there must have been enough kids in Palo Alto to start a high school. So where did the high school happen and how did that all come about?
Well, firstly, you have to remember the idea of a high school is unusual in that high schools weren't common at that time, especially for small towns like Palo Alto. But some of the residents did want a high school, and they established a privately funded high school in the upstairs building rooms of the Channing School.
Well, let me interrupt here for a minute. So in those days, we're talking about 1894, 1895, how long would a child have gone to school?
8th grade would have been normally the completion of your education, or at least your publicly financed education.
Okay.
You would then go on to probably a prep school and college if you were indeed fortunate.
Okay. So then the idea of a high school was really quite strange or different or novel.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few publicly funded high schools in larger cities, but for a town like Palo Alto, it was very unusual. And so they established the school in the upstairs of the elementary school, and then Anna Shockey, one of the local residents, had a building built over on Forest in the 500 block that was designed to house the high school for a few years, and then when the high school kids moved to a proper high school, her building could be converted into a residence, which it was. And then in 1901, the new high school opened on Channing, where the Channing House is today.
Now, tell me a little bit about Anna Shockey, because I understand she was quite an interesting character herself.
Well, she was a family living out in the Central Valley, California, and her husband was of Swiss descent, and there was a family trust, the Shockey Trust, that enabled them to borrow money against this trust, pay it back, and so that other members of the family could benefit. And she and her husband bought property in Palo Alto very early, but when he died, she decided to move from Santa Clara, where she was living at the time, to her new property in Palo Alto. And she used both the money from that trust to build her house as well as this temporary high school.
Well, it sounds like Anna Shockey and all of these other people are great figures in Palo Alto history. So how do we learn more about Palo Alto history in general?
Well, you can always come by the history desk over at the main library at 1213 Newell Road, and we'd be happy to talk to you about some more of Palo Alto's history.
Thank you so much, Steve.
You're welcome.